Greetings and hello, as we are now in the season of Lent. When you see this, we will have begun Lent, of course, on Wednesday, past Ash Wednesday. And I thought quickly just a little bit of background of this special season of the year, which is known as the 100 Days. Now, they are centered around what is known as the Triduum, and apparently the way in which this season originally began was a remembrance of the passion, of death and resurrection of Jesus. And so that the two centering events that were remembered by the early Christians had to do with Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection. And so apparently what the Christian community did was to remember, I was going to say celebrate, but that probably is not the right word here, but to remember began on Friday, Good Friday, ran through Saturday, and then concluded on Sunday. So this was the origin, if you want, of the Christian gathering, and becomes, and was even then, the center, if you want, of the liturgical year. On Friday, of course, the death of Jesus. On Saturday, Jesus in the tomb, and then on Sunday, the resurrection. Shortly, what was added to this, of course, was the supper. And so now the Triduum includes Holy Thursday, the remembrance of Jesus' supper with the disciples, then Jesus' passion, death, and ultimately his resurrection. Shortly afterwards, as this developed, they looked back to the beginning of the week, and so then you had what was known as Palm Sunday or Passion Sunday, and so now we had developed what was known, and what is still called today, Holy Week. So all of that, kind of a little bit of a background. Now, in order to kind of look at the tradition that had developed, there was, of course, between the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus at Easter and the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost, a period of 50 days. Now, how are you going to balance that in the period leading up to that? Developed a weekend known as Quinquagesima Sunday, or Quinquagesima weekend, the 50th day before the celebration of the resurrection. So now you can see 50 before and 50 after gives us the 100 days. Also added then in the 5th and 6th century, they had what was called Sextuagesima Sunday and Septuagesima Sunday. So 60 days before, 70 days before. In the liturgical renewal that took place as a result of the Second Vatican Council, those days have been dropped from our celebration. Also, then they decided that they should keep the weekday, and the gathering took place, and so there's a little bit of a history there. There would be special days, particularly the customs of prayer and fasting on Wednesday and Friday of the week, and then, of course, leading to Sunday. Shortly in the 6th century, so we are told, they added Monday, Tuesday, and Saturday. So those became special days of prayer and fasting. And finally, toward the end of the 6th century, they included Thursday, and so now you had the whole week, okay? So if you enjoy those kind of things, there's the background for the development of the Lenten period, okay? All right. Also, you will remember that throughout the liturgical year, we have 3 cycles of observance, and so there's a special cycle for this season, the Lenten season this year, which is the sea cycle. And there are kind of themes that join together the various different readings that have been chosen, particularly for the weekend or the Sunday celebrations. Particularly, there's a guide that is given in the first reading, okay, which comes from the Hebrew Bible or our Old Testament. We have, and these would be kind of the themes to notice: the first week, faith of the people of Israel; the second week, Abraham's faith and the covenant; third week, the Lord rescues his people; the fourth week, the Passover is to be celebrated in the Promised Land; and the fifth week, dream, says the scriptures, not of the past, but of the new world to come. So those would be kind of major themes that guide the choice of readings for the Sundays or weekends of Lent. The first two talk about faith that transforms. That would be weeks 1 and 2. The third and fourth deal with the converted and reconciled to the community. And then the fifth, the encouragement to live again, to regain the true dignity of the new life that we share. So those who kind of put together all of this have a kind of basic model that they are following. All right, so all of that is a little bit of background for the Lenten season this time around. First readings for the first Sunday of Lent come the first from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 4 through 10, from the letter of Paul to the Romans chapter 10, verses 8 through 13, and from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. Now, the first Sunday or weekend of Lent always focuses on the time when Jesus spends in the desert, which is generally known as the temptation sequence. So that's the one in which we will be looking at this time. Interesting, and we have noticed this certainly in the past, that the desert is the place in which Yahweh's message with Israel as well as takes place. So the desert is this opportunity for this unique union that the Lord has with his people, but it is also considered the place of Satan's temptation. So, and perhaps more in our reflections for this week, that's where much of the homiletic material often goes, and certainly that's important. The wilderness is certainly not a pleasant place. One needs to look at the desert from a practical point of view. It, as many, and even today would notice, is replete with dangers. Wild animals would be there. It would be a refuge for bandits, you know, those who were kind of looking for a place to hide out. And in the first century world was also seen as a place where the demons, the spirits would reside. Now it is interesting in this particular story, as remembered by Luke, that he calls not the tempter of Jesus Satan, but calls him the devil. So he does use, there is certainly, we tend to equate that, although we have noticed on other occasions that Satan has a different understanding in the Hebrew Bible, but by the time that Christians come with the devil, he is an evil spirit, and that's the way in which often we certainly understand that to be the situation. Now, preceding what happens in the episode that we hear today in the Gospel is that Jesus, you remember, this of course is Luke's tradition, had been baptized by John the Baptist. In fact, in Luke's story, and going back really somewhat to the Advent season, you remember that the Baptist had created a renewal community. He did not move around. He stayed in one place at the Jordan, and that various people came to be baptized. We're not quite sure what the baptism of John was all about, but it did seem to be a baptism of repentance, and that different groups had come and to be baptized, and that the Baptist had given his advice. But, and here's where we would certainly bring the emphasis this time, Jesus also had been baptized by John, and the voice at the time of the baptism had said, "My Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Now, the way in which the world looked at it this time, particularly remember the Mediterranean culture, of which certainly Jesus and the Lucan community were part of, all the spirits who resided heard this compliment from the heavens about this man, okay? And every Mediterranean native knows what will happen if someone is so honored, that there needs to be some way to let's test this. Where does he really deserve this? Are we really to pay attention to this? So what happens next is, in a certain way, by those who heard the initial story of the voice honoring Jesus, is that there is going to be some kind of, well, we might call it a test, to see whether or not this honor given by the heavenly voice is really something that is deserved and that we should be paying attention to. So in Luke's story, Jesus is led, now notice this, by the good spirit into the wilderness. So it isn't the evil spirits, but it is because God has already kind of indicated that this is his special person upon whom the good and graciousness and honor rests, is led by the Spirit. Now, sometimes, and again, as we've noticed on other occasions, it's what you do, whether it's capital or lowercase. Is he led by the Spirit? That would be capital S, by God, or by the Spirit, which is the lowercase, the force of God. But either way, it is God's goodness that brings him into the desert. Now, as we have mentioned, the desert is the normal habitant of spirits, where Jesus is going to do battle with an evil spirit, as we mentioned, the devil. Now, there is a one-to-one dialogue that takes place with the evil spirit in this episode, and it involves biblical quotes. So one notices that back and forth, both sides, both the tempter and Jesus, use scripture in making their case. The story had originally, you remember, been, and we looked at this in an earlier time, given by Mark, but Mark had given very, very, very little background about what happened in this desert experience. Matthew and Luke, however, flesh it out and create a dialogue, if you want, between the Spirit and between Jesus. And as things work well in narrations, there are 3 episodes here, or 3 times, or 3 different, if you want, tests. Now, we call them temptation, but might I suggest that really what they are doing is testing Jesus to see whether or not the honor that God had given, "This is my beloved Son," truly belonged to Jesus and he was worth paying attention to. So although we call them temptations, and certainly there's a validity in interpreting that way, but in another way it is also testing Jesus to see exactly what he will do in terms of the kind of, well, if it is a test, that the tester, in this case Satan, or in this case the devil, gives to Jesus. So notice that the way in which it works is here's the test question, what are you going to do with it, okay? Those of you who take tests know that that's pretty much the way taking a test works, doesn't it? You don't decide the question, they decide the question for you. At least that's the way most of the time it seems to work out, okay? All right. Now, the material for these tests come from the Hebrew Bible, particularly from the book of Deuteronomy. And you can check this out, but the first comes from chapter 8, verse 3, the second from chapter 6, verses 13, and the last one from chapter 6, verse 16. Okay, so that, again, kind of where the material comes from that is being arranged. Now, it is also true that Luke arranges the three tests or temptations in a different order than Matthew did, which leads us to the conclusion that Matthew and Luke both had the same source that they consulted to get the material for this episode. Who wrote first and who rearranged it differently? Well, that would be determined by the purpose of the gospel. So in this episode, it begins, and both of them agree on this, it begins with the Spirit saying, look, you've been here 40 days, and isn't that, you would be hungry too, wouldn't you, after 40 days or a long period of time? Why don't you, since you are God's beloved, since you are the special one, why don't you take some of these stones and turn them into bread and kind of eat? You know, you need your strength, you need to continue to do the good work that God has called you to do, and it's not good if you are hungry and you can almost imagine, fill in the dialogue a little bit, of how this testing or tempting might work on a person. And it's important to notice that Luke wants us to recognize Jesus as truly a human being, having the kind of needs that humans have. See, it is true he is the Son of God, but if we emphasize the divineness, well, does he really ever get hungry? Does he really ever need to eat? But when the emphasis is placed on his humanity, then being hungry makes real good sense. So you see, otherwise, I would suggest the temptation doesn't work so well. But in this case, when we think of, can you be not hungry, even if you go maybe a week? Now, I know some of you will never eat, you tend, I don't know. But anyway, 40 days without eating, come on. All right, so look, here are some stones, turn them into bread. Jesus says, no, and his response is, well, not by bread alone does but one live, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So Jesus responds to this temptation by rejecting the proposal, if you want, of the tester. All right, now here's where the arrangement of the material differs, that is, Luke's from Matthew's. Jesus is now taken by Luke to a high mountain. In Matthew, he is taken to the pinnacle of the temple. What we will notice in the arrangement of Luke is a rearrangement of that order. So all three of the episodes are there, but the presentation of the time in which it takes place is different. All right. So Jesus is now on a high mountain, wherever that high mountain is. And notice, we're in the desert, but there is no kind of geographical location of where any of these specific places might be. And in fact, when we come to the temple, well, obviously we have moved out of the desert into, so there is a movement around. Use your imagination, but notice how the material is used to develop the larger sense of what is going on here. All right. Jesus is invited by the questioner. Look, Jesus is God rather is your protector. Throw yourself down, and I'm sure that if as you come tumbling down the mountain, assuming that's the way in which it would happen, God will protect you and nothing will happen to you. Jesus responds, look, let's not be tempting God. Now it's interesting, this play occurs in this situation where Jesus is pictured saying to the tempter, look, let us not tempt God, but let God tempt us or test us, okay? If that's the way you want it to be played, that's fine. But let us not assume the opposite role. And again, Jesus thwarts the Spirit by saying, I won't do that. Now, Jesus is taken to the pinnacle of the temple. Now, why is this important? Because, as we have noticed on a number of occasions in the third gospel, the place of Jerusalem is a center in which much of the significant events in Jesus' life will take place. It is true that certainly we know this from other material in the other three Gospels, but particularly in the third Gospel, Jerusalem and the temple play a very important role. So it's that point that is being made when Jesus is brought to the pinnacle, if you want, the high place in the temple area. And bow down before me, and I will give you everything that you need, says the Spirit. Certainly a wonderful opportunity. After all, if you are the honorable one, I will give you all the power that you need, and you can do all kinds of good with this power. Notice, it isn't that I'm asking you to kind of destroy things or even to gain, although certainly if you exercise this power, they will recognize that you truly are an honorable person, and you do want them to know that, don't you? Notice there's a lot of kind of human subtlety that goes on here. And as we have noticed also, and I have not made this point before, that Luke is very interested in comparing Jesus to Adam, the first man. See, as I've pointed out, the humanity of Jesus is something that is much stressed, if you want, by this gospel writer. So there is a contrast, if you want, between Adam and Jesus. Adam, of course, is placed in a garden. Jesus is placed in the wilderness. Now, and as we saw in the garden, Adam eats. He shouldn't eat what he did, but he does eat. Jesus is asked if he wants to eat. He says no, he won't. So there's the first contrast, where Adam goes one way, Jesus goes, in this case, the right way. Power given to Adam in the garden. Well, Jesus is offered power, but he refuses to use that power in a way that establishes his own dignity, where Adam, well, if I eat the fruit and do these kind of things, I'm in charge. I have the power. So he uses it in a way that unfortunately negates rather than positizes his action. And it's interesting, too, that as Luke presents this, the devil has the ability to give this power to Jesus. See? Wow. And Jesus refuses to take something that is not God-given to him, okay? Sure, however, the devil receives, or at least says he has this power to grant this to Jesus, who may or may not. I have to be careful here, but perhaps the bottom line to this is that Adam, by assuming the power of the garden, becomes kind of a dictator. That is, he will determine what's going to happen, but he's put out of the garden, and that's the end of that. Jesus refuses to take a power that will, if you want, allow him to direct and do all kinds of things that he wants, and says, no, that belongs to God. And don't put, by the way, again, reemphasizes, don't put God to the test. So precisely, and this is what's important here, because Jesus is God's Son, he is obedient to the pattern of divine love. And it is the grace of God which drives him. And he will enter fully into the normal human life of suffering and death. So it is, yes, Adam also experienced in that story suffering and death, but Jesus experiences that by choice, not because he wants to, but because it is, in a certain way, the destiny that will play out. And so, as this episode ends, the devil leaves Jesus. He has been thwarted by the actions of Jesus. But the phrase here is, he will come back at another time. So it's interesting that this testing of Jesus, which sometimes, if you did not have that little reminder in Luke, well, he was tested 3 times, great episode, passed, everything is over, he's all set. No, Luke points out he will be back again to challenge Jesus with regard to the honorability of the power and grace and gifts that he has received from God. And that, of course, will take place in Luke's story in the garden, okay, Gethsemane later on. So maybe a reminder, too, that just because the challenges of suffering and kind of invitations to use power in a way that is beneficial to ourselves and not to others is not just given once, but many times. So all of that, there's certainly much more that we could advocate here. Jesus, throughout this episode, is under the influence of the Holy Spirit. Spirit is not the devil. Jesus honors the honorability that he has received from the voice that came out of the clouds. All right, we haven't said too much, but certainly I hope in the beginning we'll notice the first reading talks about the faith of the people of God, and it would be the people of Israel. And this, if you want, Jewish background is important, as it is for all of the Gospels, but will be important as we look at the stories connected here with Jesus as remembered in Luke. So we hope that this will be a good season, as always, of growth in our faith, which is one of the themes, certainly, of the readings of this holy season, and by the various acts that are offered to us, namely prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, makes this a very profitable season for all, not just for ourselves, but individually, but for all in the community. Thank you for being with us. See you soon.